Blog Talk Radio.
This is the news in 10 on the 30th day of August 2013. What we're doing here is combining parts of a broadcast that was originally to play on Thursday, and we're combining the two here. We were traveling, but nonetheless we have fresh information today to add to the latter part of the interview with the public TV authority in the U.S., of President Obama, and the next part preceding us is a commentary we made on the relationship between the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, which President Obama had just commemorated at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., and the current crisis in Syria. We'll go to it right now, and we'll start off with a pool report here, and you'll see it there. President Obama said on Friday that he's considering a limited, narrow action in response to Syria's alleged use of chemical weapons against its people. We're not considering an open-end affair. But the problem President Obama has is two things. The Tory Prime Minister Cameron was voted down by the Parliament. Thus, the UK, their major partner, and crime will not be there. France, under the socialist president, will be there. Unfortunately, that is an unfortunate situation for the socialist president in France and for socialism in general in the French Republic. But nonetheless, the president will get together with France and I assume Canada and some more of their lackeys in the Mideast like Jordan, etc., and call it a coalition of the willing. But the geopolitical consequences to that are very severe. China, the Russian Republic, will not go along with this, nor will its neighbors in the area, Iran, will not go along with this particular scheme there. And also this could widen into Lebanon. There are a lot of problems there, and this is the old foreign policy from the racist Woodrow Wilson, the man that brought apartheid back to American government. This is all it is about. The second pillar of President Obama's situation is his polling rate. His polling numbers now are in the high 40s in the U.S., and they could go lower when the American people wake up to the consequences of this so-called limited attack. Now, beyond that, President Obama is not running for re-election. That is a fact. But his party, the Democratic Party, will be caught in a quagmire if this thing becomes highly unpopular, and it is unpopular at this point in time, but if it extends and the war, say, is widened. The Democratic Party in 2014 here in the U.S. will have monumental problems with some of their actors there, representatives, and some of their senators perhaps will not be re-elected, period. And also in the 2016, some of the presidents laid out there, Hillary the Monster Clinton, she'd be tied in with this whole nefarious scheme. She would not be a shoo-in for the Democratic nomination. So probably that would push her into retirement. But this is in the future, and in the present. Right now there's a report that they put out. This is the U.S. government put out, and this assessment is made by the Israeli Intelligence Service. Now, if you believe the Israeli Intelligence Service, well, okay, this is dated 21 August. The U.S. government assessed with high confidence that the Syrian government carried out chemical attacks in Damascus suburbs on 21 August. We further assessed that the regime used nerve gas in the attack. These all source assessments are based upon human site geospatial intelligence, as from the Israelis, as well as a significant body of open source reporting. Our classified assessment has been shared with the U.S. Congress and key international partners. To protect sources and methods, we cannot publicly release all the available intelligence. Mr. Snowden is not working there anymore, so that will not come out. A large body of independent sources indicate that the chemical weapons attack took place in the Syrian suburbs on the 21st of August. In addition, the U.S. intelligence information there are accounts from international and Syrian medical personnel, videos, witness reports, thousands of social media reports from at least 12 different locations in the Damascus area, journalist accounts, and reports from highly credible non-government organizations. Now, they don't name these organizations, but they're not highly credible at all. Credible. They are nothing more than front groups by the Western colonial powers and the autocratic Arab regimes in the area. Preliminary U.S. government assessment determined that 1,429 people were killed in the chemical attack, including 426 children. All of this assessment will generally evolve as more information available. We assess with high confidence that the Syrian government carried out the chemical attacks. They're repeating themselves. We assess that the scenario in which the opposition executed the attacks is highly unlikely. The body of information used to make this assessment includes intelligence pertaining to the regime's preparation for this attack and its means of delivery, multiple streams of intelligence about the attack itself and its effects, our post-attack observations, and the difference between the capabilities of the regime and the opposition. This is a blunt lie because missiles have been forwarded to the rebel forces there, and they have the capabilities to deliver that. Not only capabilities, they also have the capabilities through their proxies, and the proxies there are the UK intelligence, the CIA, the NSA, the Mossad, etc., to obtain this type of gas and deliver this gas. Our high confidence assessment is the strongest position the U.S. intelligence community can take short of confirmation. We will continue to seek additional information. And the background here is the Syrian regime maintains a stockpile of numerous chemical weapons, including mustard gas, sarin, VX, and has thousands of mutations that could be used to deliver chemical munitions. To deliver chemical warfare agents. The President Bashar al-Assad is the ultimate decision maker. That doesn't mean anything. The Syrian Scientific Study and Research Center, which is subordinate to the Syrian Ministry of Defense, manages Syria's chemical program. We assess with high confidence that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons on a small scale against the opposition multiple times in the last year, including Damascus suburbs. The assessment is based on multiple streams of information. They've come up with this. The Syrian regime has a type of munitions that we assess were used to carry out the attacks on 21 August and has the ability to strike simultaneously in multiple locations. We have seen no indication the opposition has carried out a large-scale, and this was not a large-scale attack, coordinated rockets and artillery fire. The opposition has artillery and they also have rockets, and this is something this report does not make. And finally, we assess that the Syrian regime has used chemical weapons over the last year, to gain the upper hand and stalemated situations and hold strategically valuable territory. This is a blatant lie also, in the sense that the Syrian regime has been winning the battle and has won the battle. There was no rational, even illogical justification for them to use these type of weapons when their conventional weapons are working very well. We continue to judge that the Syrian regime views chemical weapons as one of many tools in the arsenal, including air-powered ballistic missiles, which they indiscriminately use against the opposition. Now, the opposition has not used air power yet, but the air power is coming. That'll be in the form of cruise missiles from the U.S. and also in bombers. And you can see how this coloring book is being colored. The Syrian regime has initiated an effort to rid Damascus suburbs of opposition forces using the area as a base to stage attacks against the regime's targets in the capital. The regime has failed to clear dozens of Damascus neighborhoods of opposition elements, including neighborhoods targeted on 21 August, despite employing nearly all of its conventional systems. Now, we assess that the regime's frustrated with the inability to secure large portions of Damascus may have contributed to the decision. This is the official U.S. government report, and it's called U.S. Government Assessment of the Syrian Government's Use of Chemical Weapons on 21 August 2013. Now, if you think about it, the 1,400 or 2,000 people that were killed at various sites, and out of this, about 1,000 adults, they say. There's not any evidence we have seen that these 1,000 people or so were fighters. Now, as far as the children, they obviously were not fighters. There's about 500 of those. But a very low number of people, and when you start looking at the raw data, they don't have it as of yet. But any of these gas, including mustard gas, that goes back to what's known in the U.S. as World War I, the Great War. It's been around for a long time. My grandfather was exposed to that in France. So in other words, nothing new on mustard gas. Many places have mustard gas. It's very simple to make and obtain. Syrian, it was, we've had in the U.S. people making it as a home brew. It is also used in Japan in the subway murders there. Nonetheless, this is our introduction. We'll go on to parts of what we did on yesterday, and then you'll hear the interview with President Obama. This is Bostonred for BR on the World on the 30th day of August 2013. Have a good weekend, those in the States and across the area, and those that are starting Friday as a holiday and across the Mideast. Also have a good holiday. Good day. This is Bostonred on the 28th day of August 2013 with the news in 10. In 10 minutes or so, we look at the world from an international perspective, which you would probably think is a bit odd, because in most countries the news is primarily international, at least if it is broadcast across the country. Now, in many countries you have state radio, state TV that broadcast news there, but there's been a long tradition, starting with the BBC, that we broadcast international news. The BBC has various services, and Arab services across the Americas, both in English, both in Spanish, and in Hindi, and various other languages. The idea there was to get the news out to the people, and of course there's a propaganda element there, but at the same time they had correspondents, and still do in many parts of the world. Al Jazeera is trying to do that in the U.S., but they have what's called Al Jazeera America, which is more of an American type of news broadcast. So what's happened here, we can no longer see on the net the Al Jazeera broadcast. It is on cable, and they are very limited there as to what you can get to the international news, is the void that they filled. At one time, the TV network CNN had international news. Christiane Aleppour was one of the people that made her reputation on it, and Bernard Cal. But there has been a situation here where the news is very microcosmic in the U.S., and thus what we've tried to do here is present the international news not only to an international audience, but to the U.S. audience from an international perspective. Thus we have the Syrian episode, we'll call it an episode, that there is a civil war within a country. And now we have the extraordinary cookie-cutter pattern of Western countries interfering, i.e. France, the UK. The Israelis are mentioned more prominently every day. Evidently they are giving armor. The Arab embassies around there, these countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., that you could not mention the word democracy. They are nothing but autocratic dictatorships by quote-unquote royal families out of the Dark Ages. But this is the type of atmosphere that you have, and the Syrian government has been a secular government. That's very important. I reiterate, a secular government, same as the government that was in Baghdad under President Saddam Hussein. He was a secular government. He was a member of the Socialist International, and so are the Syrians. Their party is called the Ba'ath Party, and so unfortunately they split in terms of what we call a schism. But that is a minor incident there. Saddam is gone. He was assassinated. His government overthrown. We still have bombings in the street. People are still dying in Baghdad and in Basra and in the Kurdish areas, etc. So nothing has changed there. Blood is still flowing in the streets. It's being shedded by ordinary people, women and children. And you would hear an interview here with President Obama. It was given to the public broadcast network, which is a public TV here in the U.S. It is somewhat government sponsored, but it also has corporate sponsors, which has tended over the years to tilt it to the right. They've had various machinations there. Had to remove some people for fiscal reasons, some people for other types of reasons. They brought in a bunch of right-wing commentators there on PBS, that's the public TV channel. And then the public radio, the other arm of it, has been thwarted with racial discrimination. They have not adjusted their model. And this is the point that we want to make, since President Obama gave the 50th anniversary speech that Dr. King gave at the Washington Monument today. Over the weekend, we had the march, and that was on the direction of Dr. Al Sharpton of New York and his National Action Network, NAACP, and a number of other organizations, phalanx. But nonetheless, back to the central question, Dr. King was there dealing with jobs and dealing with freedom. We're still dealing with jobs. We're still dealing with freedom. But he also made a very important speech on a conflict at the time that many of the old soldiers in the Great Patriotic War saw as we in the U.S. would call a two-bit war, as a 25-cent war. It was not really a war. It was a conflict. It was called Vietnam. The unfortunate situation was Dr. King came out against it. He was chastised by the Johnson administration, by all of the newspapers around the country. But he survived until he was assassinated, also like Saddam Hussein. But the whole point here is that the president was reiterating themes of 50 years ago, one step forward, two steps backward. But at the same time, we have this quagmire called Iraq. And on our regular Bostonred program, we'll get into a little of that with Marvin Kalb. He was a reporter that covered the march on Washington. And he's sitting there with John Lewis and some others, Andrew Young, prominent minister from Atlanta, who had international experience. He was the ambassador at the UN. He was also in the Congress of the U.S. He marched and worked with Dr. King. He handled press relations, and he was the mayor of Atlanta. So he has a phalanx of experience, if we have to use that term, with Andy Young. But back to the Syrian conflict, it all goes in with Dr. King's speech. And it is one of these classic neo-colonialist, interventionist situations that you are characterizing and trying to put a moral spin, and there's no moral spin to put on there because hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Does it matter if these people were killed by bombs, by munitions that are supplied by the allies of these rebel fighters? It does not. Does it matter that innocent people have been blown up with car bombs in Damascus and various other places? It does not matter. And here's where the crux of the argument. Is it conceivable that these people did not get hold of these chemical weapons and fire? It is not. President Obama was arguing in his interview that, well, because of the rocket delivery sources, but what has to happen here is an inventory of the weapons that these people are getting. They are getting Scud missiles, so thus they can fire missiles. They have captured bases where missiles were. And you would say, well, how would they fire these sophisticated things? So you have to understand that these people have military trainers from the CIA's paramilitary types to a bunch of special forces types from the U.S., from the U.K., from France, from the Mossad and the Israelis, to the best mercenaries money can buy from the Saudi Arabia, etc. So it is highly likely that they did this, but the U.S. and their allies will have nothing in this. They're taking it, Britain at least, to the UN. They will not go there, nor will they get much of a hearing. So the president is saying, well, we have to teach a lesson. What lesson is he going to teach? He'll knock out some facilities. They're not talking about 3 or 4 hours of bombing. They're talking about sustained bombings. And we've talked about that repeatedly here. What that basically means is that's over a number of days until they knock down the air capabilities of the Assad regime. That's what they hope to do, and kill as many of his fighters as they can, and thus try to level the playing field for a bunch of patsies that are not fighters. That is what they're doing, and these so-called fighters are being aided by all these mercenaries and paramilitaries that we have named early in the broadcast. Nonetheless, we will go on to President Obama's interview to tie all these things up, and some of his aspirations for his domestic program, very much like Lyndon Johnson, but his programs are on a more, as they say, limited scale than the President's Great Society. Also here, the whole apartheid and racist history of the U.S., and if we go to U.S. foreign policy very quickly, and to the man that put it all together, his name was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a president. He was a racist. The federal government at the time, in employment terms, was an integrated outfit. He segregated it. And so you can understand what kind of foreign policy the U.S. had from him. He was the master of it. It's been a racist policy ever since. They went into wars in Asia, lost those wars, the conflicts. We're talking about Korea, Vietnam. Korea, they are still there. And various other ones after. They got nothing out of Baghdad and nothing out of Kabul but red ink. Trillions of dollars lost, a few lives here and a few lives here. This is Bostonred for the News in 10. We'll start a little late, but we'll get started. Good day.
Hello, Mr. President. Thank you so much for joining us.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
And welcome to the News Hour.
Great to be here.
Mr. President, you've just come from making a speech at celebrating a nonviolent event, the March on Washington, Martin Luther King's speech 50 years ago. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But first, we want to ask you about a place where there's been too much violence, Syria. How close are you to authorizing a military strike, and can you assure the American people that by doing so, given Iraq and Afghanistan, that the United States will not get bogged down in yet another war halfway around the world?
Well, first of all, I have not made a decision. I have gotten options from our military. I had extensive discussions with my national security team. So let me talk about what's at stake here. I think we all understand terrible things have been happening in Syria for quite some time, that the Assad regime there has been killing its own people by the tens of thousands, that there are sectarian arguments that have spilled over into bloodshed and have escalated over the last couple of years. And although what's happened there is tragic, and although I have called for Assad to leave and make sure that we've got a transitional government that could be inclusive in Syria, what I've also concluded is that direct military engagement, involvement in the civil war in Syria would not help the situation on the ground. And so we've been very restrained. Although diplomatically we've been very active. We've been providing a lot of humanitarian aid to people who've been displaced by the war. But what I also said was that if the Assad regime used chemical weapons on his own people, that would change some of our calculations. And the reason has to do with not only international norms, but also America's core self-interests. We've got a situation in which you've got a well-established international norm against the use of chemical weapons. Syria has one of the largest stockpiles in the world of chemical weapons. This is a volatile country in a very volatile region. We've got allies bordering Syria. Turkey is a NATO ally. Jordan, a close friend. that we work with a lot. Israel is very close by. We've got bases throughout the region. We cannot see a breach of the non-proliferation norm that allows potentially chemical weapons to fall into the hands of all kinds of folks. So what I've said is that we have not yet made a decision, but the international norm against the use of chemical weapons needs to be kept in place, and nobody disputes, or hardly anybody disputes, that chemical weapons were used on a large scale in Syria against civilian populations. We have looked at all the evidence, and we do not believe the opposition possessed nuclear weapons of that, or chemical weapons of that sort. We do not believe that, given the delivery systems using rockets, that the opposition could have carried out these attacks. We have concluded that the Syrian government, in fact, carried these out, and if that's so, then there need to be international consequences. So we are consulting with our allies, we're consulting with the international community, and I have no interest in any kind of open-ended conflict in Syria, but we do have to make sure that when countries break international norms on weapons like chemical weapons that could threaten us, that they are held accountable.
But, Mr. President, with all due respect, what does it accomplish? I mean, the signals the American people are getting is that this would be a limited strike over limited duration. If it's not going to do that much harm to the Assad regime, what have you accomplished? What's changed?
Again, I have not made a decision, but I think it's important that if, in fact, we make a choice to have repercussions for the use of chemical weapons, then the Assad regime, which is involved in a civil war, trying to protect itself, will have received a pretty strong signal that, in fact, it better not do it again. And that doesn't solve all the problems inside of Syria. And it doesn't obviously end the death of innocent civilians inside of Syria. And we hope that, in fact, ultimately a political transition can take place inside of Syria. And we're prepared to work with anybody, the Russians and others, to try to bring the parties together to resolve the conflict. But we want the Assad regime to understand that by using chemical weapons on a large scale against your own people, against women, against infants, against children, that you are not only breaking international norms and standards of decency, but you're also creating a situation where U.S. national interests are affected, and that needs to stop.
Mr. President, with all of the mayhem in the Middle East involving allies like Israel and Jordan and refugees on the border and potential action in Syria and the collapse of the government in Egypt, do you worry at all that your administration underestimated what the toll would be of an Arab Spring?
Well, I don't. I think we anticipated this would be a really difficult process. I mean, you've got a region that for decades had basically been under autocratic rule, and people had been suppressed, and there were no traditions of civil society. There were no traditions of political freedom. And then suddenly, folks are allowed to express themselves, but a lot of their organizing principles end up being around extremist agendas in some cases. More moderate forces sometimes haven't yet got their act together. So we anticipated that this was going to be a very difficult path. We're not surprised by it. The one thing, though, maybe implicit in your question, Gwen, is some suggestion that there was something we could do to prevent it.
My question.
And I think if the idea is that what we should have done is done more to shore up autocratic governments, that we should have stood by while governments that we had relationships with killed their own people, peaceful, innocent protesters, then I suspect you'd have a different set of questions for me. And so we don't have good options, great options for the region. But what I am clear about is that if the United States stands by its core values and its core interests, if we're very clear about making sure that we're stopping terrorist attacks against the United States, if we are very clear about our commitment to the safety and security of Israel, if we are clear about the free flow of energy throughout the region that affects the entire global economy, but also if we're clear about our values and that we believe in inclusive governments, that we believe in the protection of minority rights, that we believe in women's rights, that we believe that over time it's better for governments to be representative of the will of their people as opposed to being dictated to by authoritarian governments. If we are consistent in those principles, then eventually I think we will be better off. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to have some very difficult problems in the meantime.
I do have one more brief question about
Sure.
Syria. To the American people who look at this and say, why are we getting involved? How do you justify taking action? I know you talked about international norms because of chemical weapon use, but not because of the 100,000 people who were killed there in the past and the 2 million refugees who fled across the border.
Well, what's happened has been heartbreaking, but when you start talking about chemical weapons in a country that has the largest stockpile of chemical weapons in the world, where over time their control over chemical weapons may erode, where they're allied to known terrorist organizations that in the past have targeted the United States, then there is a prospect, a possibility in which chemical weapons that can have devastating effects could be directed at us. And we want to make sure that that does not happen. There's a reason why there's an international norm against chemical weapons. There's a reason why consistently the rules of war have suggested that the use of chemical weapons violates Geneva protocols. So they're different, and we want to make sure that they are not loose in a way that ultimately could affect our security. And if, in fact, we can take limited, tailored approaches, not getting drawn into a long conflict, not a repetition of Iraq, which I know a lot of people are worried about. But if we are saying in a clear and decisive but very limited way, we send a shot across the bow saying, stop doing this, that can have a positive impact on our national security over the long term, and may have a positive impact in the sense that chemical weapons are not used again on innocent civilians.
Let's turn back to where you were earlier this afternoon, the Martin Luther King anniversary of his "I Have a Dream" speech, the anniversary of the March on Washington. You have a reputation, Mr. President, for being pretty cool and detached, but standing there at the Lincoln Memorial, at the place where Dr. King stood, looking out over that big crowd, that had to be emotional. What were you thinking?
Well, there were a couple of things I was thinking. Certainly leading up to the speech, I was thinking that you generally should not try to follow one of the two greatest speeches in American history because it puts a little pressure on you. But most of all, what I was thinking about was just what I talked about in the speech. All these ordinary folks who did extraordinary things. There aren't that many examples in American history, maybe even world history, where you see maids and seamstresses and porters and laborers who are able to fundamentally transform the most powerful country on earth. And to do that with the kind of sacrifice and dignity and passion, but also discipline that they showed during the course of the movement is not just inspiring, but gives you a sense of humility and a desire to do everything you can on behalf of the principles for which they fought.
Why was it important to you to be there today, to be part of that?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I would have wanted to be there even if I wasn't speaking, just because I think that day is as important a day as any in our history. We rightly celebrate the heroism of those who fought and died to protect us. We rightly celebrate things like the moon landing that show the extraordinary creativity and innovation of America. But that day captures something that is special about this place, and that is the capacity for ordinary people, for citizens, to change structures of oppression that have been in place for decades, and to do it peacefully. It not only gives you a sense of the power of individuals, but it also says something about the power of America to transform itself, and we're all beneficiaries of it.
Mr. President, as we watch the way you take actions on these things that you talk about, you take legal means, legal actions. The Attorney General is suing the state of Texas over voter ID. He's talking about rolling back mandatory minimum sentences. And at the same time, the Supreme Court seems to be heading in the opposite direction. Right. How do you get done what you say you want to get done in leveling that playing field?
Well, I would distinguish between civil rights issues, voting rights issues, some of the core legal protections that came about in 1964. In those areas, it's true that we've had some opinions, the most prominent one being the case where the Roberts Court struck down a key segment of the Voting Rights Act, where we just have to try a whole range of approaches to make up for those decisions. So I will be working with people like John Lewis and reaching out to both Republicans and Democrats in Congress to see if Congress is prepared to amend the Voting Rights Act to ensure that people are not being prevented from voting. But Congress doesn't move real quickly around here, and if we can go ahead and move administratively so that our Attorney General can go ahead in jurisdictions that seem to be intent on preventing people from voting and that have a racial element to it, even though largely it's probably for partisan reasons, then we need to go ahead and enforce the law. And the Voting Rights Act has a number of tools. Section 4, which was struck down, was not the only tool available. So we're going to do that. As I said in the speech, though, there are a broader set of issues that have to do with the economy and economic opportunity and the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and the continuing barriers that African Americans and Hispanics and increasingly working class whites have in terms of living out the American dream, being able to get a job that pays a decent wage and having health care and making sure that their kids can get the education they need to compete. And on those issues, it would be very helpful if Congress moved. But once again, we're not going to wait for Congress. So I want to get early childhood education done because we know that's the single most important thing we can do to increase upward mobility and opportunity for disadvantaged kids. And if Congress isn't willing to pass a law, then I'll start meeting with mayors, and we'll start meeting with governors, and we'll start meeting with non-for-profits and
including mayors who pass things like stop and frisk.
Well, the fact that a mayor may have one policy that I disagree with doesn't mean that I can't work with them on others. And so we'll use the convening power of my office to try to move the ball down the field. There are some things that we can't do on our own. I strongly believe that we should be passing an increase in the minimum wage that hasn't, as a practical matter, really gone up in a very long time when you factor in inflation. That would make a difference for millions of people around the country. I think that it is important for us to make sure that we're rebuilding the infrastructure of this nation. We could be putting people back to work right now, increasing the growth of the economy, reducing unemployment, those things I need Congress to do. But there are other things. For example, we went ahead and are moving forward on something we call Connect Ed, that makes sure that every classroom in America is connected to wireless internet so that new technologies are accessible to every child in this country. And it turns out we can do that without congressional action. So where Congress is unwilling to move, we'll move. Where it can't, we can't. But the goal of my speech today, I think, was to just remind all of us that for all the victories that we won over the last 50 years, what you now have is a situation in which all working people, all middle-class families are under strain. And we have increasing inequality in this society, and we've got to do something about that, and we can do something about it as long as we keep our eye on the ball.
And let me just pick up on that, because you did tie Dr. King's vision to your own agenda, and you've been able to do help the country in many ways. We didn't go into the economic abyss after the financial collapse. Wall Street's booming, corporations are making great profits, but as you pointed out today, average wages, the gap between the wealthy and those who are not wealthy has never been bigger than it is today. The wages, especially of African Americans, haven't improved. Mr. President, how much does it weigh on you that your policies haven't made more of a difference in those areas?
Well, it certainly weighs on me. In my first term, essentially my job was to make sure, as you said, that the economy didn't just completely collapse. It collapsed, but it didn't go into deep depression. And the reason that had to be a top priority was because if it did, the folks who would have been hurt even worse were those middle-class families and folks trying to get into the middle class, who would have lost even more than they did. And what we were also able to do, at least in my first 2 years, was to initiate expansions of Pell Grant programs, or make sure that we were providing help to cities so that they could hire young people during the summers. But, obviously, an agenda that puts more people back to work has met resistance from the Republicans in Congress, and I recognize that. But what is both troubling, but also, I think, gives me a greater sense of urgency is the fact that this is a trend that's actually been going on for a couple of decades now. As I mentioned in the speech, you've got technology that has reduced manufacturing jobs that used to be a foothold into the middle class, that has reduced things like bank tellers or travel agents that used to provide a good middle-class livelihood. And the new jobs that have been produced don't pay as much. You've got global competition, jobs being shipped overseas. All these things reduce the leverage that workers have. And as a consequence, it's a lot harder for every worker, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, to ask for a raise. And employers know that. And companies